Yeah.
Well, I'm Dr. Richard Buswell. I'm a retired physician, been retired for about 7 years now, and um, I became interested in medicine when I was 16. I just knew that was what I wanted to do, and I went to Carroll for undergraduate degree in pre-med there, which as I shared with you earlier, it was a really quality time at Carroll. And then on to what then was the University of Oregon Medical Center in Portland. It's now Oregon Health Science University, 3 times the size of the campus when I was there. And then following my medical degree, I went to the University of Colorado for my residency. Did 2 years in the public health service in Bethesda, Maryland. And then I came back to Colorado to finish my residency and did a fellowship at the National Jewish Hospital in Denver, which is, I think, probably the world's largest hospital devoted to respiratory diseases. Certainly the country's largest, but I think maybe the world's largest too. So 13 years were spent out of state getting the education that we don't offer here in Montana, the first 3 years being at Carroll. And then I practiced in private practice of asthma and allergy for 37 years, having retired 7 years ago. And then while I was in the public health service, Seth, I became interested in photography and bought my first cameras, 2 cameras, bodies, 2 lenses, my darkroom equipment, and I just dove in head first. I'm entirely self-taught. I didn't have any formal instruction. I dove in with the darkroom work, and I'm still doing it 50 years later. I still use film. I still use my original cameras, my original lenses, my original darkroom. I don't have a thing that's new, and they all work, and they work just fine. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It started out as a hobby, as I said, when I was in the public health service, and remained a hobby when I was practicing medicine for 37 years, because a solo practice is so time-consuming, plus family and other interests as well. But now that I'm retired, I have more time to spend with photography than I did before.
Yeah.
It's a kind of an all-consuming hobby now.
Yeah.
Spend a lot of time at it, but as I will get into later, I suspect, I've been interested in Montana ghost towns and homesteads since childhood, really. My parents would take me ghost towning on weekends, and of course then I wasn't interested in photography, but when I started developing this interest in photography, I started pointing my camera at places I'd visited as a child, ghost towns, homesteads of Montana, and just western Montana. I haven't done eastern Montana, really. And that's what I've been focused on, so to speak, for 50 years, is capturing artifacts of the Montana frontier, primarily. Excuse me, there have been a lot of artists or photographers over the years who photograph ghost towns and homesteads because they're very photogenic. So I don't take a picture of an old building just to have documented that's an old building. What I look for is something unique about that old building. And more often than not, when I'm out in the mountains, I don't find anything unique. I've seen that before, so I don't even bother getting my cameras out of my Jeep. Move on to the next site. So during the course of a year, I usually end up exposing 15 to 20 negatives total, black and white negatives total, just because in all these years of doing it, I've seen so much, and there's nearly no point in photographing it again if I've seen it before. So the challenge aesthetically for me now is to find something I haven't seen before. And then once you find that, then you expose the negatives, of course, for it. And then there's the darkroom season, which is usually the cold winter months here. And then you hope that what inspired you to take that negative is captured on film. And if it is, then I start making prints after that. I learned by making my mistakes. And so I didn't have an instructor to tell me do this or do that. I just learned purely and simply by trying it, and if it didn't work, well, you move forward from there and you learn from it. So I have a large library of fine arts actually in our home, and a good amount of that is photography. So I read a lot about photography, especially black and white photography over the years. Ansel Adams, who I met one time, but he published 5 books in black and white photography, and I read those cover to cover. So self-taught again, but the books have really helped.
That's cool. You got to meet Ansel Adams?
I did, yeah, in Carmel.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah, yeah.
By chance, or was it
By chance. Yeah, so there was I don't know if you've heard of the photographer named Ruth Bernhard. She was a contemporary of Ansel Adams along with Edward Weston as well. And perchance, Ruth Bernhard was having an opening in a commercial gallery in Carmel. And my wife and I went to the opening, and lo and behold, there was Ansel Adams. And Ruth Bernhard and Ansel were friends. And so there was a crowd of people around Ansel, as you may imagine. But eventually I worked myself in, introduced myself, got to shake his hand, talked a little bit about photography, and so it wasn't much of a introduction, but I can honestly say, yes, I met Ansel Adams.
That's pretty interesting.
I never read all of his books. It was when I first started photographing ghost towns and homesteads of Montana. The imagery was more representational in nature, but I quickly realized that that type of work has been done lots, because ghost towns are so photogenic that I early on switched from representational work to more abstract close-up work. So my favorite lens out of my 5 lenses that I have is my macro lens, which is a close-up lens. And there's a whole world of imagery in it with a macro lens that you walk right by with just a normal camera lens. So if you look at the books, you'll see early on there was some representational imagery in there, but the last 4 books, I would say, are more devoted to abstract for one thing and close-up photography for another. Two answers to your question. First of all, I was born and raised in Helena, so the western Montana topography and its inhabitants has special interest to me, because this is where I was raised. Secondly, when I was practicing medicine, I was in solo practice, and you don't go very far when you're in solo practice. So there's a whole world of imagery, I'm sure, in eastern Montana, just that I didn't have time to go over there.
Yeah. Imagine, just being busy.
Yeah. Well, I have a wife and 3 kids as well. Now we have grandkids, so it's a lot. As you know, as a father yourself, there's a lot of balancing that goes on.
Absolutely.
So once I have a negative that I'm happy with, then the next phase is, of course, making prints from that negative. And what I've learned over my 50 years of doing this is I will always start with a lower contrast print to begin with, and then I'll make kind of a medium contrast print, and then I'll make a higher contrast print, and then if it's still lacking the contrast that I want, I'll use a high contrast developer with maybe more time in the developer than I would normally give it as well. So to answer your question again, you hope you got a negative, and then once you get there, then it's in the next phase, if you will, is experimenting with different grades of paper, with different types of paper as well, and then continue to hope, that it's all going to come together. And it comes together to the tune of about 15 to 20 prints per year. I usually will make the prints the keepers, if you will, in editions of 6. And one of those I keep for myself. One goes for copyright, because everything I've done has been copyrighted as well. And then the third one oftentimes goes to museums as well. But I have some additional 3 copies that, in case there's more museum interest than I anticipated, that I have more to share with museums.
Yeah.
Let me comment on something you mentioned just a minute ago, too. There are photographers who shoot, but they have and shoot film, but they have nothing to do with the subsequent printmaking as well. They hire that out. And I've always had a problem with that because getting a good negative is one part of the process. The other part of the process is translating that negative to a print. As I mentioned before, the grade of the paper, the type of the paper, the size of the paper, all of those come into play, and I make those decisions. Nobody else makes those decisions for me. And then when I get a fairly good print, hopefully it's good enough that I'll want to keep it as in my oeuvre, you might say. But sometimes I'll work with the print, and it still falls short of my expectations. But I make that call. So from the time the negatives are exposed to the time that the print is matted and dry mounted in some cases, it's all something I do by myself. The only thing I don't do is I don't do my own framing. I hire that out. But everything else is it's a one-person show.
Yeah. Yeah. Every once in a while. Why aren't allowed me to do that?
Well, you know, a favorite phrase of mine that rolls through my mind quite often is if I get a really high-quality print, I take credit for it. If I get a lousy print, I'm forced to take credit for it. So something went wrong in the process. Yeah. The negative wasn't exposed right.
Rich, yeah.
It's all my responsibility. The balance was sometimes dictated by what I was doing. So when you're in a solo medical practice, somebody calls us in trouble. I mean, it's obvious you have to put everything else aside and take care of the person who's in trouble. Close behind that is a wife and 3 children. So if they have activities going on that you don't want to miss, then photography takes a back seat again. So I would say, looking at those 3 factors, photography has always been a third tier, if you will, by necessity, because medical practice and family does take precedent in the big picture.
Yeah.
In the process of poking around ghost towns and homesteads, Seth, more commonly than not, I will come across abandoned vehicles, which have their own aesthetic. I mean, you look carefully at an old car body, truck body, whatever, as well as the ghost town or the homestead as well. And I've seen lots of old radiators over the years of poking around. But this particular one, called crushed radiator, it was just that. And what kind of fascinated about me, what crushed it? Why was it like that? And I still don't know the answer to it. But it's an abstract image in my mind. It's not representational. And the minute I saw it, I thought, there's a photograph there. But the mystery of what caused that radiator to be crushed kind of adds to the intrigue of the image as well, to my mind, because I have not a clue what crushed it, but it did.
Yeah, absolutely. Why is it still here?
Well, it's a motivating moment, really, because where I go tends to be fairly remote areas. Most people, maybe hunters, don't, the exception, but most people don't get there. So one of the things in these old towns, these old homesteads, is there's still some artifacts. Excuse me. With some of them have been picked clean, but others have artifacts remaining. And it's kind of, as you just said, it's amazing what's still out there. But so I have one of those days, Seth, when you find a ghost town, a homestead where there's still artifacts. It really makes the day, because it might very well render an interesting photograph. But a lot of ghost towns, especially, which are often on public land, have been picked over. So if I had to choose between a ghost town, which is usually in a mining camp, or a homestead on a ranch or a farm somewhere, the homesteads will usually have more artifacts because they're in private land. They haven't been picked over as well. But the point is, there's still a lot of stuff out there to be seen if you're willing to go the distance and hike into these places and spend the time of looking at them, not just in a cursory fashion, but looking at them in depth. There might be a knot on a wall that has a particular photogenicity. So it has nothing to do with the ghost town. It's the lumber or the log, but it's still something of interest out there.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think contributes to a lot of the artifacts being still in place, Seth, is the fact this huge state of Montana only has 1 million people. So we're Alaska's first, California's, Alaska first, Texas, California, then Montana is the size of the state. It's huge, with only 1 million people on it. So that lack of population oftentimes makes for fertile hunting when you're looking for ghost towns or artifacts, and nobody has picked them over yet.
Yeah.
Well, one of the compelling reasons that I continue to do black and white, Seth, black and white negatives, black and white prints, is the permanence of them. They're silver-based, they're metal-based, and so a black and white print, just to talk about prints, has a long, long, long life expectancy if you don't expose it directly to the sun for prolonged periods of time or major changes in heat. For example, black and white by itself is a pretty stable medium. But then you can do things to the black and white print called toning. So when I have a black and white print that I'm happy with, I then run it through a solution of gold, or I run it through a solution of selenium, both of whom are inert metals. And those inert metals attach themselves to the silver, and they prevent that silver from oxidizing. So Ansel Adams, again from reading and from talking to him, for as long as I've known, he's always done either gold-toned or selenium-toned black and white prints. And if you look at his early work, which dates back to the 1920s, it looks like it's made yesterday. And you can't say that for color, traditional color, and even digital, that's going to fade someday. But black and white, especially if it's stored archivally, with a stable temperature and in a storage room that doesn't have a lot of light, it'll probably last for centuries. So to answer your question, a motive of mine in doing black and white is preserving some of these artifacts or ghost towns for future generations, because I'm going to be gone someday, ghost towns are going to be gone someday, but the photographs hopefully will last for centuries.
Yeah.
Well, to speak to the artifacts, when I find something that's photogenic, but also I can pick up, there is a sense of reverence, and I think reverence is perhaps the best choice of word there. That was in somebody else's hands at one point in time. Whose hands were those? And most of the time I have not a clue who that mining camp was from. But I guess from my imagination, you might say, it gives me a sense of reverence. I revere the fact that that artifact has been there for 100 years, and here I am holding it in my hands, and how many generations of people held it in their hands as well. It's an interesting feeling. Well, of those 5 books that I have, Seth, all the photographs have a story with them, have a narrative with them. And I can bore you to tears sometimes talking about this photograph or those photograph, the difficulty of finding it for one time, the calories expended to get to that site, the time required to set up my camera on tripods and measure the light and wait for the light to change to a better light or something. So they all have little stories that go with them. Which we're not going to get into today, but sometime we could. Well, any successful artist will testify, I'm sure, that it's a lot of work. It doesn't just happen. So that's one thing, is I worked at photography, not only getting to the sites where something is to be photographed, but then developing the negatives, making a variety of prints. Preserving the prints as well. It involves a lot of work. So early on, let's say 48, 49 years ago, I started getting some museum attention for what I was doing, because a lot of museums haven't seen the kind of subject matter that I photograph, especially museums back east, for example. So the subject matter oftentimes attracted a museum curator, a museum director, and in some cases they would bring it into their collection or exhibit the work. And then once you have that foundation of a few museums under your belt, if you will, other museums oftentimes begin to take interest as well. So at the moment, I have 233 museums that have collected my photography. It's amazing to me. It really is. And the one that's probably the highlight of the 233 museums is Yale University. They purchased my entire collection for their permanent collection as well, and that I'm still floating in air about that.
It's very remarkable.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, Harvard has too. I mean, so many of the Ivies have collected my work, not to the degree that Yale has, but work involved in making your art successful. It doesn't just fall in your lap. There's a lot of work involved with that, and sometimes the process, as I mentioned earlier before, if you get a few museums that have taken an interest in your work, then it's oftentimes other museums will perk up and follow suit as well. And then another thing that enters into it too is during the course of interacting with museums, you become familiar with curators or directors, not only of that museum, but other museums as well. So then you have a person to approach about interest. In some museums, what I do is way outside of their area of interest, a rejection, if you will, but it's just not in their area of interest. Other museums that it is. So it's taken a lot of years for one thing, a lot of hard work for another, but it's been a very satisfying hobby, which is now kind of a full-time passion for me. I guess if I had to put that into one word, is passionate. Have a passion about what you're doing, and if you're passionate about it, you'll probably work hard at it. And if you work hard at it, it's probably going to pay dividends in the long run.
That's true.
Well, especially well, speaking for myself, Seth, if I find something that's photogenic, it's no longer work, it's play. Mm-hmm. It's fun. But I can't tell you the number of times that I will work to get into a remote area, carrying all my gear in, and there's not a darn thing there to photograph. So you put your tail between your legs and go back in your Jeep and look for another site. So you have to keep in the forefront of your mind that every once in a while you're going to find something that really speaks to you, and it's worth the time to put into representing that in an artistic way. It's just, it really is how it is. You invest your heart in what you're doing in the moment, and if it works out, good expenditure of time. Yeah. But as any artist will tell you, there's sometimes you try and try and try, and you just can't make it work. Yeah. And so you've invested all that time, all that work in something that just didn't cut the mustard.
Absolutely.
Well, the benefits of keeping at it, even after 50 years, Seth, is I continue to find things that draw me to them to photograph. So that's an obvious thing. Secondly, it gets me out into Montana, into the landscape of Montana, which I love. And more often than not, I'm by myself. So you get into kind of I hate to use the word meditation, but you're by yourself, you're in this glorious place we call Montana there. So that adds to the attractiveness of what I do. And then the third thing that adds to the attractiveness of it, Seth, is I meet people along the way. I'm on a big ranch, for example, and I stop to get permission from the rancher to go up that draw or up that mountain to photograph something. And then we start conversing and establish a relationship. Well, show me what you're doing. So I show them the books, for example, and then we have a conversation. So I've met a lot of friends and I have a lot of relationships of people that I cherish over 50 years, in addition to the landscape, in addition to the photographs.
Yeah.
So all of those things keep me going. Yes, sir.
That's really amazing.
Yeah, the one take-home message that I would leave to whatever burgeoning artists that are out there is keep your passion. And there's sometimes when you'll feel defeated about your passion because it's a piece that you really enjoy, but doesn't seem to be of interest to anybody else. But then you do it for yourself, rather than everybody else. But then you come across a museum, for example, that really relates to what you've been doing, and that's always icing on the cake.